The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
The truth is out there. Follow us.
We interrupt this program for a special report by WKMU.
We will return you to your scheduled programming shortly. Can't sleep? Neither can we. And who are we? Well, I'm Sky, and she's Blue. And dial in as we explore everything from the 1,200-year-old structure, Göbekli Tepe, to UFOs, conspiracy theories, and bizarre stories from around the globe. Tune in at wkmu.podbean.com. That's wkmu.podbean.com.
This concludes our broadcast day.
Those who strayed into this abyss from the safety of the middle-class Victorian world were struck dumb by what they encountered. The broken pavement, dim gas lights, slicks of sewage, stagnant pools of disease-breeding water, and rubbish-filled roadways foretold of the physical horrors of what lay within the buildings. An entire family might inhabit one vermin-infested furnished room with broken windows and damp walls. From The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. I am excited to feature The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, a book I bought during my spring 2023 trip to England. Marvelous book. It resonates with my love for true crime and giving voices to the victims. I applaud Ms. Rubenhold for her thorough research and empathy portraying these women as more than just victims of Jack the Ripper. So this is episode 123, Never Just Prostitutes. I also recognize that we need to examine the Ripper's murders. So I have utilized two other major sources for this trilogy, highlighting Russell Edwards' book, Naming Jack the Ripper, The Definitive Reveal, published in 2014, and I find his research meticulous and compelling. Plus, Robert House's book, Jack the Ripper and the Case for Scotland Yard's Prime Suspect. It also served me well in presenting this case. And I used London's Black Museum files on Jack the Ripper, given to me by Catherine Ramsland. So how cool is that? All of my sources, given that this is an especially huge case, they're all on my blog, June 2025 at www.murdershelfbookclub.com. So our book club snacks for today, since we're going with the London 1888 theme, watercress sandwiches. And this couldn't be simpler. You make egg salad, you mix in salt, fresh ground pepper, and paprika to taste. You put the egg salad on 4 slices of white bread. You place chopped watercress, or arugula works just fine, and parsley on top of the egg salad, cover with slices of bread, cut off the crust, and slice the sandwiches diagonally. And voila, you have watercress sandwiches. I am pairing our traditional English watercress sandwiches with Lady Londonderry tea from the Irish Eyes Tea Company of Lidditz, Pennsylvania. Now, Lady Londonderry tea is described as a refined and radiant blend that captures the charm of a classy tea with a bright modern twist. A round, malty cup balanced with a floral note. Delicate strawberry and lemon accents hold a touch of fruity brightness, making it the perfect companion for afternoon indulgence. And I agree, 100% delish. Londonderry tea is priced at $5.50 an ounce, and you can place your order in person or online. Contact information for Irish Eyes Tea Company is on my blog, so check out the Irish Eyes Tea Company of Lidditz, Pennsylvania. Bon appetit, murder bookies. So before we begin, the 5 references many, many streets and locations woven throughout these women's stories. Now, as an American, I am unfamiliar with many neighborhood names, but I know my UK murder bookies will find this context valuable, so I have included some. You can also refer to the map on my blog to see where we are in 1888 London. And currency. All right, so I tried to overlook references to pence and pounds, but they really can't be avoided. Pounds is represented by an L-like symbol, which originates from the Roman term libra, which is a basic unit of weight. So in 1888, the British Empire had a 1 pound coin known as a sovereign, which was equivalent to 240 pence, 83 pence, 46 pence, 20 shillings, 10 florins, 8 half crowns, or 4 crowns. Okay, but no one in our story has the sovereign, the 3 pence, the 6 pence, the crowns, or half crowns. The 5 women do not possess the more valuable coins and will be dealing primarily with shillings and pence. And a special thank you to Kate Tattersall for her helpful webpage, Kate's Adventures, at www.katetattersall.com. Now, when studying victimology, the environment in which the victims live is essential. The 5 were all working class poor, making them highly vulnerable and at risk. Hallie Rubenhold vividly describes the contrasting sides of late 19th century London, beginning in 1887 during Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. London is the world's largest city, the capital of the largest empire on the planet. The upper class live on the west side, dominated by theaters, gardens, restaurants, and shops selling international and domestic goods, and beautiful Hyde Park. The lowest classes eked out an existence over on the east side, plagued by disease, poor sanitation, poverty, crime, and alcoholism. Queen Victoria's 50th year celebration, with decorative red, white, and blue banners streaming, have people from all different backgrounds gathering to celebrate, eager to see the royal family and toast the Queen. The festivities include state banquets, military reviews, and entertainment for children in the parks, with vendors selling meat pies. Women wore their finest bustled gowns, and men were elegantly dressed, contributing to the pageantry. And the presence of foreign dignitaries, like the princes of Siam in Persia and the Maharaja Holkar of Indore, added an exotic touch to the celebrations. Yet, quote, Londoners had long realized that Trafalgar Square sat on the axis between the east and west of the city, the dividing line between rich and poor, end quote. Migrants and those living in poverty slept on the streets, and this was far preferable to the demeaning and unsanitary conditions of local workhouses. A water shortage had led to a significant decline in agricultural jobs compared to previous years, worsening the unemployment situation. The homeless gathered in Trafalgar Square, setting up a camp. Widows sold matches to support their children, while elderly couples, evicted due to unfortunate circumstances, blended in with the downtrodden. The author writes, quote, at Trafalgar Square, the daily speeches given by socialists and reformers, such as William Morris, Anne Besant, and George Bernard Shaw, led to a mobilization as chanting and banner-waving processions of thousands spilled into the streets. Inevitably, some resorted to violence, end quote. The Metropolitan Police and the Grenadier Guards worked extra hours to manage the crowds, removing those likely to incite violence. Ultimately, the police, fearing a social revolution, banned all gatherings in Trafalgar Square. a decision taken as an act of war by the 43,000 people who sought to voice their grievances to the crown. Violence erupted, with the poor using lead pipes, knives, and bats to smash windows in a display of public outrage. The police responded with truncheons, and this event became known as Bloody Sunday. After the violence subsided, what was exposed was the, quote, unspeakably horrendous conditions of what had been chronically ailing the East Side and other impoverished parts of London, end quote. 35% of the population of East End lived below the subsistence level. For 50 years, writers and reformers had highlighted the plight of the poor, the situation worsening in the 1870s and 80s during the Long Depression. Low-income housing was demolished to make way for railroads, leading to a decreased availability of rooms and increased rent. Whitechapel was hit the hardest, along with neighborhoods Bermondsey, Lambeth, and Southwark. Quote, by the end of the 19th century, 78,000 souls were packed into this quarter of common lodging houses, furnished rooms, warehouses, factories, sweatshops, pubs, cheap music halls, and markets. Its overcrowded population represented diverse cultures, religions, and languages, end quote. For 200 years, Whitechapel was a destination for immigrants. Author Robert House noted that the East End was viewed as a breeding ground for prostitution and other forms of degenerate behavior due to this overcrowding, where entire families were sharing a single room. In the 1850s, workhouses were established to provide temporary shelter for the poor and the growing immigrant population. However, by the late 1880s, these structures were dilapidated with crumbling interiors and squalid conditions, and many faced a harsh choice: endure the lice-infected workhouses or sleep on the streets in the rough. Whitechapel also had 233 licensed lodge houses, which accommodated 8,530 people. For a mere 4p, the poorest of the working class could secure a stifling dormitory or a single room for the night, and 8p bought a really gross double bed for married couples, which could include a sex worker and her client. Russell Edwards notes that a typical 4-bedroom house today accommodated the equivalent of 50 beds for rent in that same space in 1888. Clean sheets were supposed to be provided once a week, and windows were meant to be open to let out the foul air, although this rarely happened. Fun fact: Whitechapel is named for a small white parish church called St. Mary Matfelon. Now, the best lodges had communal kitchens where people would naturally gather, as we still do, getting a meager meal or some tea or beer. Better establishments even had a stove or fire for warmth. Language was crude and rude, even in the presence of children. Violence and assault were as common as the overflowing toilets and casual sex. Finding a woman servicing a client in a room, an alley, or along a street wall was common, and this was often not full intercourse. Career prostitutes, or unfortunates as they were called, worked out of the lodges, especially after the Criminal Law Amendment Act was passed in 1885, closing brothels. Oh boy. But still, the lodge provided shelter for women dealing with all kinds of misfortune. Some women resorted to casual prostitution when short on money for a bed, even as they strove to support themselves by selling flowers, matches, and knitted items. As a necessity, they paired up with a man for protection and savings. And some of these liaisons were short-lived, while others lasted years, all out of bounds of matrimony. This nonchalant casting off of one partner after another horrified the middle and upper classes. Whitechapel centered around Commercial Street. From here, the most notorious streets were Thrall, Flower and Dean, and Dorset, all associated with immorality, crime, and violence. On Dorset Street, there were lodges with 700 beds. Flower and Dean held around 1,200. Also prevalent in the East End were pubs, often owned by lodge owners. So in 1888, a year after the Queen's Golden Jubilee, brutal murder occurred in Whitechapel, electrifying the public after the first woman's body was discovered, followed by 4 other gruesome murders, these being the 5 canon victims of Jack the Ripper. Sensationalizing during the Ripper case, newspapers wrote that workhouses were brothels in all but name, and all of these women were prostitutes. Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, stated that 1,200 prostitutes lived in Whitechapel's common houses. Now, Hallie Rubenhold ponders, quote, if the large house population was comprised of 8,530 people, and a third of these, or 2,844 residents, were female, and if it is accepted that 1,200 of these women could be identified as prostitutes, that would still indicate that the majority of them, or 1,644, were not engaged in any form of prostitution at all. End quote. Good point. Now this part blew my mind. Quote, Jack the Ripper killed prostitutes, or so it has always been believed, but there is no hard evidence to suggest that 3 of his 5 victims were prostitutes at all. End quote. And this is the first I've actually heard of that, which is why I'm doing this book. In the 19th century, women had few to no rights and no voice, and the poor were considered lazy and deserving of their fate. With a murderous lunatic on the loose, police made assumptions and concocted a good story to reassure the upper classes that they were safe. And so, with the setting established, let's begin. August 31st, 1888. In Whitechapel, the body of Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was discovered by Charles Cross as he approached the gate of Brown's stable yard on Bucks Row. In the dark, early morning hours, it was difficult to see when another man, Robert Paul, approached Cross asking what he had found. Then they realized it was a woman lying on the ground, her skirt pulled up. While pulling the skirt down to afford her some modesty, they left, each planning to notify the first police constable they encountered. Polly Nichols had been seen walking around 11 p.m. that evening, and then again at 12:30 a.m. when she left the Frying Pan Public House. At 1:30 a.m., Polly returned to the lodge on Thrall Street after having had her fill of ale. She did not have the pence to pay, but she asked the warden to keep her regular bed for her because she would be back. That night, Polly was feeling cheerful, sporting her nifty bonnet. An hour later, good friend Ellen Holland came across Polly, who was staggering and drunk. Ellen tried to convince her friend to come with her and they could share a bed, but Polly was confident that she would get the money she needed. Emily would later say she heard the clock strike at 2:30 a.m. before they parted ways. But now Charles Cross and Robert Paul had found her body, encountering police constable Jonas Mezzin, taking him to where they found the body. Police constable, PC, John Neal, also arrived at the scene, having walked by just 30 minutes earlier. Polly was lying on her back, blood oozing from a gash across her throat. Fortunately, Dr. Rees Ralph Llewellyn lived nearby and rushed over. He would pronounce Mary Ann Polly Nichols dead, the body taken to the morgue on Old Montague Street. Examining her wounds was gruesome. Her throat was cut twice, one wound extending down to her spine. A long jagged incision ran from her ribs to her groin, as other stab wounds dotted her lower abdomen and vagina. Bruises on her neck may have indicated that she'd been strangled. Her petticoats were stenciled with Lambeth Workhouse, which led to the identification of her body. Inspector Frederick Albeline would oversee the investigation into the shocking murder. The police quickly canvassed the area, gathering witnesses who provided no significant leads. However, this was only the beginning, the first in a series of brutal murders. But first, who was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly? And we begin Part 1, The Blacksmith's Daughter, August 26, 1845 to August 31, 1888. Mary Ann Polly Nichols' stories begins with a vivid description of Fleet Street, a bustling thoroughfare with horses, carriages, and carts, which served as the center of the printing trade. Soot-covered men in canvas smocks hurried about, examining long printed sheets suspended from ceiling-mounted drying racks. From Fleet Street, a maze of medieval passages and alleys extended outwards, lined with rotting wooden and brick homes stacked one against another. These were the shelters of the working poor. In one of these dilapidated century-old homes, Carolyn Walker gave birth to her second child, a daughter she named Mary Ann. Edward Walker, Mary Ann's father, was a blacksmith who provided typeface for the surrounding printers, and this was a respected skill, and Edward earned just enough to support his wife and what would be 3 children: Edward Jr., the eldest, Polly, and Frederick, the baby. Their lives were stable, a fact they never took for granted. Illness, accidents, or sudden unemployment could easily send them into the streets if they failed to pay their rent, for indeed life was precarious. Now, school was not compulsory until 1876, but some working-class families sought upward mobility by sending their children to local charity schools for a small fee. Literacy was highly valued in these communities, partially due to their ties to the printing trade. Polly was remarkable for her time because she had learned to read and write. Polly's mother, Carolyn, came down with a hacking cough laced with blood, likely tuberculosis. She died in November 1852, leaving behind a family in crisis. Most commonly, after the loss of a wife, children were sent to the workhouse, but Edward Walker was determined to raise his brood at home with help from his sister-in-law, Mary Webb. But tragically, Carolyn had unknowingly transmitted her tuberculosis to her 3-year-old son, Frederick, who died soon after, mother and son buried together. Polly had significant responsibilities resting on her slender shoulders and developed a strong bond with her father. Facing all of these difficulties, amazingly, she continued her education through her teenage years. In 1861, a man named William Nichols was living in a man's lodge house, working as a warehouse laborer. The son of a printer, he aimed at establishing a career in printing. After meeting Polly Walker, with her father's approval, they became engaged in December 1863, marrying on January 16, 1864, in Bride's Church. But with this, the family dynamic changed. Polly soon became pregnant, and December 17, 1885, she gave birth to William Edward Walker Nichols. Tragically, little William failed to thrive and passed away before his second birthday, which was all too common. Polly became pregnant again, prompting the family to move south to a 2-story brick cottage with 4 rooms in a neighborhood of carpenters, machinists, and shopkeepers with large families. While conditions were still poor, but with 3 wage earners, Edward Sr., William, and Polly's brother Edward Jr., they were somewhat better off than most. However, Polly continued to have a baby each year, with Edward, George, and Alice joining the family, adding financial stress. And then finances worsened when Edward Jr. moved out to start his own family. Now I am coming to a wonderfully positive part of the book. After all of the descriptions of filth, crowding, disease, poverty, there was a beacon of hope. An inspirational American financier, George Peabody, made a generous gift to his adopted city of London, aimed at directly improving the lives of the poor through the development of good housing. He would fund the construction of Peabody buildings, spending the equivalent of $60 million today on this initiative. When the first 57 units were available, there were over 100 applications received. Now, there are requirements. Renters had to be poor Londoners by birth or residence, possess moral character, and be good members of society. And importantly, no one would be excluded based on their religious beliefs, a welcome stipulation. Proving successful, more Peabody sites were built in Islington, Shadwell, Westminster, and Chelsea. The Peabody buildings provided superior quality housing for the working class, promoting health and well-being. Built from brick with gas lighting, the units featured wooden floors and cement white walls, varying in size from 1 to 4 room units wrapped around a central courtyard. Each kitchen included cupboards, a Ranger oven, and meat safes for food preservation, as refrigeration just wasn't happening yet. Buildings also had indoor toilets and sinks shared between 2 apartments, gas-heated baths funded by Peabody, and an attic laundry facility with large windows for drying clothing. Residents had to keep their apartments clean and could decorate them as desired. Given the poor housing conditions that existed, these Peabody buildings were impressive. Yes, character was important for tenants. Trustees reviewed applications, conducted home visits, and excluded habitual drunks, individuals with criminal records, those with high incomes, or extra-large families. And tenants were required to be vaccinated against smallpox. While children could play in the courtyard, they had to keep their voices down in the common area. Women were forbidden from taking laundry in to earn extra income. So in 1876, William and Polly Nichols were deemed the ideal tenants for a Peabody residence, and I cheered out loud. Polly had to be elated having a kitchen, bathroom, separate rooms for the children and adults, and the privacy she longed for. On July 31st, 1876, they moved into the second floor of D Block Apartment 6. And overall, this system worked really well, with everybody motivated to uphold the standards of their neighborhood. Tenants here included railway porters, packers, policemen, widows, laborers, and domestic servants, with wives taking turn watching the children for widowed fathers. Widows would often meet widowers and eventually married, and life would continue on. In April 1875, Sarah Vidler and her children, including 21-year-old Rosetta, moved in next door to the Nichols family. Rosetta was married to a ship's cook named Thomas Wools, but his long absences at sea led to the breakdown of their marriage, with them drifting apart. Now, this is not acceptable in the Victorian era, with Rosetta in a difficult position. She took various jobs as they became available, including helping Polly Nichols after the birth of her new baby Henry in December 1878. But unfortunately, not everything was idyllic for William and Polly. Arguing often, William claimed Polly's drinking was an issue. Now, this may have been exaggerated at this point, because any serious problem would have been noted by the Peabody trustees, resulting in eviction. Polly's father later revealed that William had started an affair with Rosetta. Trying to cope, Polly would escape to her father's home, overwhelmed by caring for 5 children, with Rosetta living next door. Yeah, I understand that. Their conflicts escalated, with emotions running high, and in March 1880, Polly left William, never returning, a decision that significantly affected the rest of her and her children's lives. So I have to say this, being judgy, William wins the equivalent of the lottery. His family is accepted into a Peabody building, living in luxury compared to the overwhelming majority of his peers, with 5 children and his wife, and he can't keep it in his pants. So sad, just so sad. Well, a year later, styling herself as Mrs. Nichols, Rosetta and William welcomed a newborn son. Arthur was baptized along with Polly's youngest, now 5-year-old Henry, and their irregular union, completely immoral, was either not noticed or overlooked. Although others had been evicted from the Peabody for separating from their spouses and cohabitating with new partners, they took the risk and gambled that they wouldn't be exposed. Desperate the day Polly Nichols left, she went to the Lambert Union workhouse. Now, this is an indicator of just how upset Polly was choosing an incredibly unpleasant workhouse with the accompanying social stigma. Those in the workhouse were viewed as lazy and immoral drunks who bred illegitimate children and relied on others to pay their way. The 1834 Poor Law reforms had 2 main goals that guided the operation of the workhouses. First, to instill regular habits in the poor by forcing them to work for minimal sustenance, often in a squalid environment. And second, to put the fear of God in them so they would never want to return, reforming them into upstanding, industrious citizens. Quote, "The primary function was to humiliate those who were forced to rely on it. Regardless of the circumstances, the old, infirm, the sick, and abandoned, the able-bodied but unlucky, were treated with equal disdain. If the head of the household lost his income, he and all his dependents had to join him under the workhouse roof." End quote. In the workhouse system, families were often separated, allowing only children under 7 to stay with their mothers. Individuals bathed in communal water and received a standard uniform. Their diet consisted mainly of thin porridge, bread, cheese, and potatoes, with the occasional unknown meat. Men broke rocks for road construction, while women pumped water and did laundry. Polly, raised in a respectable family, living a dignified life with her husband and children, would have been horrified at her situation. Choosing to separate from her husband and children ended her respectability. Culpability be damned. Even if Polly could afford a divorce, she couldn't get one. For women, in addition to citing adultery, she would need to prove additional wrongdoings by her husband, which William Nichols had not done. Her only option was the workhouse, claiming she had been deserted. Now, the law required husbands to support their wives, and the failure to do so brought William before the magistrate. The workhouse desertion investigation was done by Thomas Taverner, and he awarded Polly Nichols a weekly maintenance payment of 5 shillings to be paid by William Nichols. Now, unlike many women in this situation, Polly did not move in with family, struggling to adapt to independent living. With rent at 4 shillings a week, she had little left for herself. And the sin is, even if Polly could find a job, such as seamstress, laundress, or maid, the salary wasn't enough for her to survive, and a job would demand 70 to 80 hours a week of grueling work. Viewed as a failure, condemned by society, with no options, Polly may have sought out a new partner. About this time, William and Rosetta discovered that Rosetta's husband, Thomas Wolves, had moved to Australia, with any chance that he might return gone. Eager to establish their own household, William found the 5 shillings needed to pay Polly a burden. And he discovered if he could legally prove that Polly was living with another man, he would be free from his support obligations, since wives could not commit adultery without their husband's consent. Talk about stacking the deck. Now, an 1881 document shows that a laundress named Mary Ann Nichols was living with George Crenshaw in North London. William's gotcha moment. When Polly tried to collect her maintenance from Mr. Taverner, she discovered that William had not paid it. Going to court, William presented evidence from a private investigator indicating that Polly was living with Crenshaw. Protesting vehemently that she certainly was not, the court absolved William of all financial responsibility for his wife. And unfortunately, it was likely that Polly was telling the truth, because if she had been with Crenshaw, she probably would not have become so completely destitute. On April 24, 1882, Polly entered the Lambeth Union Workhouse, staying until June 2nd. Leaving the workhouse meant facing life on the streets, where women resorted to begging, prostitution, or theft for a night's lodging. But this time, Polly moved in with her father and brother, adding to the already crowded household, as Edward now had 5 children of his own. And living at her father's, she no longer had to abide by the workhouse's ban on alcohol. Feeling belittled, mocked, despised, I suspect Polly began to imbibe to numb the emotional pain she carried. Quote, she had lost her home, her husband, and her dignity. More excruciatingly, she had lost her children, and the sight of her nieces and nephews could not fail to serve as a constant reminder of her worthlessness as a mother. Drink offered a way out. End quote. Belligerent drunken arguments began, although her father would swear that she wasn't out late, certainly wasn't fast, and he had never heard of her doing anything improper. 2 years later, Polly was not on speaking terms with her father when she moved in with Thomas Stewart Drew, a widowed blacksmith with 3 daughters. Once again, Polly could assume the role of wife and mother in a home, granted without marrying Thomas. In June 1886, Polly ran into her brother Edward, with him reporting that Polly looked clean and respectable. But fate would ensure that this domestic bliss would not last. The sudden tragic death of her brother, caused by an exploding kerosene lamp, sent Polly into a downward spiral, escalating her struggle with drinking, which she had been managing until then. Not long after, her relationship with Thomas Drew ended, and a month after that, he married. The possibility of returning to the workhouse loomed again. However, Polly was determined not to go back. In October 1887, Polly Nichols was arrested for begging, which was keeping her out of the workhouse. After returning to Lambeth again, she joined a program that helped older women find employment in domestic service. Polly began a new job on December 16th, but it didn't last long, and that may not have been entirely her fault. Contrary to popular belief, she did not choose a life of prostitution, even though she now enters this period of vagrancy. Under vagrancy laws, beggars, criminals, and prostitutes were all treated the same. Anyone living on the streets was deemed guilty. Tramps like Polly took any work they could find, living hand to mouth while avoiding the workhouses. They often used the casual ward, a temporary shelter with terrible conditions filled with drunks. After 2 nights, a person couldn't return for 30 days and was forced back to the streets. Now, under these conditions, Polly faced additional dangers, experiencing verbal and sexual harassment and being vulnerable to assault and rape, adding to her misery. Quote, after nearly 6 months of vagrancy, the formerly respectable, well-behaved tenant of the Peabody building had evolved into a disorderly, foul-mouthed menace. End quote. Oh God, what a shame. Ill from tramping, Polly was admitted into the infirmary. Recovered by February 12, 1888, she was sent back to the workhouse. But Lambeth Union did not want Polly, so they offered her a placement as a domestic servant instead. A Mrs. Sarah Cowdrey of South London, an ardent Baptist, wished to help the homeless and destitute. Her husband, Sam Cowdrey, was chief clerk of the Metropolitan Police, and theirs was a dry home, so no alcohol permitted. And this environment would benefit Polly, who was close to losing her battle with alcoholism. Polly arrived at the Cowdreys on May 12th, being handed 2 sets of clean, fresh clothing. Quote, a decent bonnet, shoes, a nightgown, cap, pinafores, a shawl, and a pair of gloves and undergarments. End quote. Her task would be to clean the rooms and cook the meals. She was given her own room in the attic with her own bed, a true luxury after sleeping in doorways. And Polly wrote her father of her new situation. Quote, my people went out, so I am left in charge. It is a grand place with trees and gardens back in front. They are teetotalers and very religious. Nice people, and I have not much to do. I hope you and the boy, her elder son was residing there, are all right. Goodbye for the present. Yours truly, Polly. Answer soon, please, and let me know how you are. End quote. A roof over her head, clean clothes, lice-free hair, 3 meals a day. It must have seemed like heaven to Polly. But it didn't last. On July 12th, Sarah Cowdrey informed the workhouse that Polly Nichols had deserted her position, taking the wardrobe and vanishing. I guess the desire for alcohol was just too strong to resist. Polly likely pawned what she could, using the money to buy a bed each night at the women's only Wilmot large house, which would be an unusual choice for a woman who is remembered for being a sex worker. At Wilmot's, Polly had formed a friendship with an older woman named Ellen Holland, and they shared the cost of a double bed. Ellen described Polly as melancholy and noted that she mostly kept to herself, associating with only other women. By August 24th, Polly was running low on funds and had returned to tramping. On August 31st, at 12:30 a.m., Polly was drinking at the Frying Pan pub, having spent her lodging money. She encountered Ellen around 2:30 a.m. and said she would return to Wilmot soon. Now, at 12:30 a.m., Polly had little hope of begging for money to sleep in her safe bed. Walking and turning onto Bucks Lane, she likely pressed herself against a recessed gate, utterly exhausted and inebriated, and dozed off there, where Jack eventually found her. Inspector Abilene brought William Nichols in to identify his wife, and he recognized her immediately. Quote, this was indeed Polly, the woman he had once loved dearly and married, who had borne 6 of his children, who had comforted and coddled them, who had nursed him in times of illness, the woman with whom he had shared laughter and at least a handful of joys for 16 years. End quote. Nichols was upset, muttering, quote, I forgive you on account of what you have been to me. End quote. I think he got that wrong. I hope you forgive me for being a cheat and not treating you with the dignity and respect I owed you as the mother of my children. There, I fixed it for you, William. Later, at the coroner's inquest, Ellen Holland testified that Polly was, quote, a very clean woman, end quote, in terms of her moral conduct. However, papers would report that Polly was involved in prostitution the night of her murder, which would eventually align with police theories about the Ripper killings. Polly's father, Edward Walker, and William Nichols both denied these accusations of prostitution. Walker insisted Polly was not promiscuous, but Nichols made a statement admitting he had stopped his wife's support because she was living with another man, this reinforcing negative assumptions about her character that have continued until the 21st century. Part 2, Annie Chapman, September 1841 to September 8, 1888. On February 10, 1840, the long-anticipated wedding of Queen Victoria to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha took place, celebrated with shouts of "God Save the Queen." This marked the first time that the public was allowed to view the bridal procession of a monarch, with the route carefully secured by regiments of soldiers. Among those who gathered at St. Paul's Cathedral was a young woman named Ruth Chapman, 22 years old. Having been baptized just before leaving home to seek work in the capital, Ruth was in love with George Smith, a trooper from the 2nd Life Guards. Since only 6 out of 100 enlisted men were permitted to marry, Ruth was considered a dollymop, a term used to describe a woman in a monogamous relationship with a soldier without being married. The military believed that a decent working-class girl was unlikely to spread infectious diseases to her soldier. Well, in January 1841, Ruth gave birth to her first child, Annie Eliza Smith. Once her condition became apparent, Ruth would have lost her job and found herself entirely dependent on George for his unreliable financial support. They both knew that George could be deployed anywhere across the vast British Empire at any moment. As a dollymop, Ruth did laundry and sewed for the regiment, living in a room near the barracks that cost 1 shilling a week. 5 months later, Ruth found herself pregnant again, and fortunately, on February 20th, 1842, Ruth and George were granted permission to marry. However, Ruth would always insist that they were married the same day as Queen Victoria and her beloved Albert. Becoming an official army wife did not significantly ease life for Ruth or the children. They received half rations and lived in the barracks that had no designated married quarters at that time. Sheets were hung to divide the living space from the other men, and conditions were damp, dark, and dirty, with insufficient latrines and washing facilities. But there was one crucial benefit. Army savings banks allowed soldiers to set aside a small sum for their families, along with a small stipend for housing outside the barracks. After the Smiths' marriage, George, Ruth, and little Annie welcomed George, Emily, Eli, Miriam, and William. As a military family, their children were required to attend a specialized school designed to mitigate the challenges of growing up in the barracks, signaling to the soldiers that their queen cared about their welfare. Annie received a superior education and learned valuable skills in needlework and knitting, a benefit to the regiment. But the downside of military life were frequent moves that interrupted this schooling. But nevertheless, Annie's childhood would allow her to see beyond the working class, living in Knightsbridge with, quote, elegant stuccoed fronted villas and Windsor in the shadow of the royal family's residence, the sights of ladies in expensive silk bonnets and titled gentlemen whose uniforms clanked with medals would have seemed ordinary, as would a glimpse of Queen Victoria trotting on horseback through Windsor Great Park, end quote. Their streets were clean and well lit, devoid of anyone sleeping on the stoops. As the daughter of the regiment, Annie was instilled with values of honor and dignity, which were reflected in her behavior. George Smith's modest salary made their costly home on Kemple Terrace in Windsor a challenge. The house, with a view of the River Thames, had 2 parlors, 3 bedrooms, and a shared servants' quarters, housing 3 army families. Other rental homes were in poorer condition and often near notorious music halls. Now, during this era, disease outbreaks were common, with children often falling ill from scarlet fever and typhus. While Ruth cared for newborn William, Annie would look after toddler Miriam and the other children, until deadly scarlet fever struck, resulting in the deaths of both Miriam and little William. Soon after, son Eli passed away, followed by their oldest son George, who was just 12, dying from typhus. Only Annie and Emily remained. Oh, can you imagine losing all your kids this way? Despite the tragedy, Ruth and George pressed on and welcomed another daughter, Georgina, followed by Miriam Ruth. At nearly 15 years old, it was time for Annie to earn her keep, which is a rite of passage for young women. So from 1851 to 1891, 43% of teenage girls entered domestic service. And in 1861, Annie began work as a housemaid for architect William Henry Lewer at 2 and 3 Duke Street in Westminster, who shared a home with his bachelor brother Edward, a retired stockbroker. With 3 maids, Annie was the junior one, often tasked with the most difficult chores. She assisted the cook, Mrs. Ford, and had little time for herself. Her salary was modest, ranging between £9 and £14 a year, according to Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management. So that's about £2,400 or $3,200 in 2025. If an employer provided tea, sugar, and beer, her wages were reduced further. With only a day and a half off each month, Annie rarely saw her family in Windsor, and George now faced retirement after 21 years in the Army. He and Ruth had a newborn son, Fontaine Hamilton Smith, named after George's captain, John Glencairn Carter Hamilton, who was later the first Baron Hamilton of Dalzell. With a commendable service record, George planned to become a valet for his commanding officer, Roger William Henry Palmer, who had participated in the charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War. Mrs. Beaton writes that the valet tended their masters by, quote, dressing them, accompanying them on all their journeys, as well as acting as their confidants and agents of their most unguarded moments, end quote. Cleaning their clothes, carrying water for baths, packing and unpacking, trimming hair and beard, the day of the valet was busy but honorable. It was a great boon to be part of the Palmer household, as he would be elected to Parliament and his family had estates in Ireland. In 1862, George switched, becoming valet to Captain Thomas Naylor Leyland, a well-paying position among the top of his household servants. He moved Ruth and the children to Knightsbridge, near Leland's mansion, Hyde Park House. George would also travel to Paris for Leland's wedding at the British Embassy. However, this travel and long hours left him little time with his family, which began to weigh upon him. In June 1863, while serving at the Denbighshire Yeomanry Cavalry Races, George shared a room at the Elephant and Castle with other staff members. After a long day, George remained cheerful. And the next morning, around 7:30 a.m., a servant called out to George, urging him not to oversleep, and George assured him that he was awake. An hour later, the landlady went to check on George and discovered him with his throat cut, a razor lying next to him covered in blood. George was dead. Shocked, Thomas Naylor Leyland raced to the scene, horrified that his loyal valet had committed suicide, and he took on the responsibility for covering George Smith's funeral expenses. After George's death, Ruth and her daughters, along with 2-year-old Fontaine, lost his pension and relied on the income from Annie and Emily. Fortunately, they avoided the workhouse and moved into a comfortable lower middle-class neighborhood in Knightsbridge. Ruth likely received financial help from Leyland, which she invested wisely by renting out rooms and taking in laundry. One of her lodgers was John Chapman from Suffolk, which was a center for racing and breeding horses, who met Annie Smith. At 27, Annie was teetering on the verge of spinsterhood, so marrying John Chapman would provide her with a home and a chance to start her own family. Shortly after celebrating their wedding at All Saints Church in Knightsbridge, Mr. and Mrs. John Chapman posed for a photo in their wedding attire. Annie sat on a chair with a Bible on her lap, while John stood beside her, reflecting all their hopes and dreams. Quote, Annie, the daughter of a gentleman's valet, had done well to marry a gentleman's coachman. John Chapman was not a hackney cab driver, the sort known to loaf about in pubs. End quote. A private coachman, John was employed by wealthy families as they needed him, playing the Chapmans on the top of the servant hierarchy. He and Annie would live in a cottage by the stables, enjoying some independence. He earned a salary of £35 to £80 a year, plus tips, which provided them with a better quality of life than many in their social class. Annie could stroll past gas-lit shops of Piccadilly and Bond Street, shopping for hats and jewelry at the Burlington Arcade. However, work could ebb and flow in London. The ideal scenario was to secure a permanent position with a wealthy family outside the city. But relocating could be difficult after all of the deaths in the Smith family. And John was now the only male at home, with Emily, Georgina, Miriam, and Fontaine. In 1870, Annie went to her mother's to give birth to her first child, a girl named Emily Ruth. 3 years later, Annie Georgina joined the family. Annie dressed Emily in a lovely tartan dress for a photograph. And 3 years later, a photo of little Annie in the same hand-me-down dress was taken, and the photos were a gift for Ruth, as John had taken a job as head coachman for Francis Tress Barry, a wealthy man with a country estate in Berkshire. He would manage the stables with at least 30 horses and supervise a team of grooms and stablemen. In Berkshire, the coachman's cottage was the best home Annie had known, featuring a sitting parlor, living room, kitchen, scullery, larder, and 3 bedrooms. She hired a daymaid, embracing her middle-class status, while Emily attended a reputable ladies' school in Windsor. They enjoyed using the Barry estate for walks and had access to carriages for shopping in town. Annie and John were thriving, and she took pride in their success. In 1878, Barry entered royal and aristocratic circles after befriending Edward, Prince of Wales. On June 15, 1881, he hosted a royal party at his home for Ascot Week, attended by notable figures like Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, and the 5th Earl Spencer, the great-great-great-grandfather of Diana, Princess of Wales, among others. While John busily organized carriages for the guests, Annie enjoyed the royal spectacle from her cottage. And Annie's future should have included raising her family and saving money to buy a small house in Windsor for when John retired. Their daughters would marry middle-class men, their lives improved and successful, but this plan was disrupted because Annie was an alcoholic. Public drunkenness was seen as immoral, so Annie would likely have tried to conceal any dependence. Sister Miriam would write that she and her sisters took a pledge of abstinence, only Annie was struggling to maintain her promise. Did Annie drink to numb the pain of loss? Well, with London's disgusting water supply, low-alcohol beer was common, and brandy or sherry was used for various ailments like coughs or rheumatism. With 20,000 pubs in London in 1870, perhaps this is what influenced John's decision to take the job in the countryside, while it may have left Annie feeling isolated even in their lovely home. Miriam's writings reveal that Annie had 8 children, 6 of whom were affected by alcohol. Emily was healthy at birth, but developed epilepsy by age 8. Ellen Georgina lived just 1 single day. Annie Georgiana was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, featuring small, wide-set eyes and the smooth ridge from nose to lip, as seen in the photograph that was commissioned. Born in 1876, Georgina only survived 2 weeks, while George William Harry, born in 1877, passed away just shy of 3 months old. Miriam Lilly was born in July 1879, passing in October. In November 1880, their final child, John Albert, was born with paralysis. The Smith family believed Annie's alcoholism was to blame, supported by a medical journal from 1878 that noted the significant impact of maternal drunkenness on infant mortality. These losses likely deepened Annie's depression as she struggled to care for her disabled son. Annie desperately wanted to stop drinking, with Miriam persuading her to take another abstinence pledge. As she struggled with sobriety, her eldest daughter Emily fell ill with meningitis and passed away on November 26, 1882. This tragedy drove Annie deeper into alcoholism, leading to public drunkenness that caught the attention of the Windsor magistrates. Recognizing the urgency, sisters Miriam and Emily took Annie to Spilthorne Sanitarium just outside London on December 9, 1882. The facility specialized in treating middle-class women and emphasized willpower in overcoming alcoholism, combined by chapel attendance with activities to improve one's habits. Situated on 4 treed acres, Spelthorne provided a clean environment where patients attended gardens, worked in the laundry, while crocheting and doing needlework. During her year there, Annie made significant progress without causing trouble. Her husband, John, visited frequently, paying the 12 shillings for her care. In December 1883, after a successful home visit, Annie was discharged from the sanitarium, and Miriam wrote that Annie emerged, quote, a changed woman, a sober wife and mother, and things went on very happily, end quote, for a number of months. Then, a single illness changed everything forever. John became seriously ill with a cold and prepared himself a hot toddy, tea and whiskey, to help warm himself. After drinking this, he kissed Annie, the flavor on her lips, which brought back all the cravings to her. And in less than an hour, she was a drunken mad woman. This slip devastated Annie. After a year of progress, it was all undone, and simply crushed, Annie gave up. John knew it was over. While the Barrys had been patient, they could no longer tolerate Annie's behavior, especially with royal visitors coming to the estate, and an ultimatum was issued: remove Mrs. Chapman or be fired. As the father of 2, one disabled, he had no choice. He would separate from Annie, despite his deep affection for her, paying her 10 shillings a week as she returned to her mother's home. With support from Ruth and her sisters, he hoped that Annie would recover. With the breakup of her marriage, leaving her children, and abruptly living among her family of teetotalers, who may have shamed her for her weakness and failure, it had to be very difficult. But Annie could not do without, so she left, her fall unredeemable in their eyes. Annie would move out on her own, leaving her previous life behind. Now she rented a cheap room in Notting Hill. There she collected her maintenance payments and drank. The female drunkard was, quote, an abomination, one who allowed their most brutal and repulsive penchants to come to the surface, one who abandons herself to sensuality and who becomes unsexed in her manners, end quote. In Victorian society, a drunken woman was immoral, a fallen woman, considered the lowest of the low, an outcast. Just like Polly Nichols, Annie found herself in a desperate situation that required her to seek a male protector. In late 1884, she met Jack Spivey, and moved to Dorset Street in Whitechapel, known for being the cheapest and filthiest area filled with crime and poverty. Annie rarely shared her painful past with her friends, like Amelia Palmer. When discussing her children, she said her son was in the hospital and her daughter had joined the circus. Amelia would describe Annie as straightforward, clever, and never one to use foul language, at least when she was sober. In December 1886, Annie's maintenance payments were cut off as John fell gravely ill and was in the care of an elderly friend, Sally Westell. Distressed to hear this, Annie walked 25 miles to Windsor in the snow to see John, their reunion painful. John was shocked by her disheveled appearance, but evidently he had turned to alcohol to numb his pain and eventually died of cirrhosis of the liver. Broken-hearted, Annie never fully recovered. By early 1887, without her maintenance money, struggling with depression, Jack Speedy ended their relationship. Seeking to survive in the slums, she briefly entered into a relationship with Harry the Hawker, which ended due to his abuse. Amelia describes Annie as very unhappy, and she had likely contracted tuberculosis. Despite her illness, Annie tried to work by crocheting doilies and selling flowers and matches. In late summer 1888, she traveled to Kent to pick hops, writing letters to her family, too embarrassed to share her address. After her death, during the coroner's inquest, her brother Fontaine mentioned that he had seen her a few times and had given her money. He, too, had become an alcoholic, but managed to hold a job in printing. Annie's new protector was Edward Ted Stanley, a respectable brewery worker. And during this time, she bought 2 brass rings, wearing them like a wedding band, to create a sense of respectability that was important to her. As her health declined, she relied more on Ted, who stayed with her over the weekend of September 1st, paying for her bed until Tuesday. Annie likely went to the infirmary briefly, hoping to recover. On Friday, September 7th, Amelia reported seeing Annie, who seemed weary and struggled to sell her crochet work for bed money. There are no records of her checking into a casual ward or a workhouse, so on the nights that Ted hadn't paid for her, she likely slept on the streets. Tim Donovan, the lodge manager, would say that Annie stopped by Crossingham House the afternoon after visiting the hospital. She ran into Amelia Palmer near Christ's Church and returned to the kitchen around midnight. Annie told William Stevens that she had managed to beg 5 pence from a relative, likely her brother Fontaine, which she spent on drinks. By 1:15 a.m., with no money to pay for her bed, she asked Tim Donovan to trust her for the rest, which he refused. While Annie stated she would be back soon and headed toward Spitalfields Market, wondering who could lend her a halfpenny. She told nearby night watchmen, "Make sure Tim keeps my bed for me." But Annie never returned that cold, wet September night. At 5:30 a.m., a woman was seen speaking with a man near 29 Hanbury Street, as reported by witness Elizabeth Long, who was certain that that woman was Annie Chapman. Elizabeth Long hadn't gotten a good look at the man, but said he, quote, looked foreign, a euphemism meaning Jewish. Now, 29 Hanbury Street was well known to those who slept in the rough. There were plenty of common areas, such as a yard next to a gate and staircase landings. Familiar with the location, Annie would have felt relieved to find a gap between the house steps and the fence unoccupied, curling up against the wall. And this is where the Ripper found her, brutally cutting her throat, along with inflicting other indignities upon her. Albert Kadosh, living next door to house number 29, heard a woman shout no and a thud against the fence, but dismissed it as noise from drunks. Meanwhile, John Davis, from 29 Hanbury Street, descended the back stairs to the yard to use the privy. When he opened the door, he was met with a shocking sight: the mutilated body of a woman, her skirts pulled up, revealing a ghastly wound to her stomach, skin draped over her shoulder, along with her intestines. Annie Chapman's head was nearly severed. Davis went into shock, and Inspector Joseph Chandler was notified. Local constables sealed off the area for investigation as Dr. George Bagster Phillips arrived shortly after the police began canvassing the neighborhood. Dr. Phillips noticed a great deal of blood had been lost. In addition to the more obvious injuries, his examination revealed that the woman's uterus and parts of her vagina and bladder had been removed. Now, this caught my attention because I had always heard that Jack the Ripper was meticulous with his blade, but this seems sloppy to me. If he wanted the uterus, he wound up taking parts of 2 other organs, contradicting this idea that he's some kind of expert surgeon. Oh, and of significance, those 2 brass rings that Annie was wearing, they had been forcefully removed. This murder was similar to that of Polly Nichols, especially in its brutality. Later, it was written in the Lancet Medical Journal that the murderer likely had medical or anatomical knowledge. But again, I'm not fully convinced. I'm imagining a killer covered in blood spatter, carrying organs, sneaking past the residents of Hanbury Street as they're waking to begin their day. So how did Jack the Ripper vanish so quickly? He had to live in the area and had to know it well. Well, as the news of another murder spread, the panic and fear grew sharper. What were the police doing? Anything at all? 3 days later, on September 10th, Sergeant William Thicke arrested Whitechapel resident John Pizer, only giving a momentary relief because it was proved that Pizer had an alibi for the murders. So this did little to ease the growing terror sweeping London, fueled by sensational news stories. And this is not an exaggeration. One woman, Mary Burridge, suffered a fear-induced fit, dying from fright. By now, police saw the perpetrator had developed a ritualistic style to his kills, all of which occurred at night, possibly included strangling, and certainly stabbing, slashing, and organ removal as souvenirs, and as he horrifically mutilated the genitals of the victims. Now, Annie Chapman was much more than a victim, and she was clearly not a prostitute. Ironically, a year before her murder, Police Commissioner Charles Warren stated to his officers that they could not label any woman a prostitute unless she identified herself as one or had been convicted of it. Like Polly Nichols, quote, contrary to the romanticized image of the Ripper's victims, she never walked the street in a low-cut bodice and bruised cheeks, casting provocative glances beneath the gas lamps. She never belonged to a brothel, nor had a pimp. Neither is there any evidence that she was arrested. End quote. But despite evidence to the contrary, police inaccurately listed Annie Chapman's occupation as prostitute, which influenced the direction of the subsequent investigation. Reporters accepted this as fact, sensationalizing the story and fabricating quotes to increase sales. Now, coping with his sister's brutal murder was incredibly difficult for Fontaine, especially with these news reports. His other sisters were utterly devastated as well. A month later, Fontaine suffered a total breakdown. Drinking hard, he stole money from his employer, abandoning his wife and 2 children, and disappeared. A week later, he walked into the police station, turned himself in, and wrote a confession. And he added, quote, "Oh, my darling wife, it is all the cursed drink. For God's sakes, don't let the children touch it." End quote. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 3 months hard labor. On release, he took his wife and children across the pond, settling in Texas to begin anew. And that concludes this episode for today. And in 2 weeks, I will be back with my next episode, Women with No Voice, as Hallie Rubenhold's The Five continues. And I am announcing our next book Thank you to my Patreon murder bookies. A Dark Night in Aurora, Inside James Holmes and the Colorado Mass Shooting by Dr. William H. Reed. This is a very difficult story. Remembering what happened and who the victims were is important. On July 20th, 2012, a man in dark body armor and a gas mask killed or injured 70 people at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Surprisingly, he was taken into custody alive. Only one forensic psychiatrist had access to James Holmes, and this book reveals what he discovered. I will also be referencing Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer, tells her story by Dr. Lynn Fenton, who treated Holmes prior to the shooting. So that's our next book coming up after the 5. I have a few special episodes that'll be dropping too, so subscribe and do not miss a thing. Remember to use the code MurderShelf and save 10% on your CrimeCon Denver 2025 badge. Thank you for listening. I see you as you hear me. My sources, including crime scene photos, maps, recipes, and drink selections, are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, June 2025. You can contact me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or find me on X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. See you back here in 2 weeks for part 2, Murder Bookies. A term used to describe a woman in a monogamous relation. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.